Amidst a rising fourth wave, Prime Minister Trudeau decided to get the public say on his minority government and the state of the House. The electorate's reply? Basically status quo. Why and what message should each of the parties take from that? Let's get into this and find out. In the downtown core of the provincial capital, there's John Duffy, former Liberal strategist for Prime Minister Paul Martin and Premier Kathleen Wynne. He's a founding principal at Strategy Corp. And David Tarrant, a Conservative strategist who worked with Prime Minister Stephen Harper, Opposition Leader Andrew Scheer, and Premier Doug Ford. He's a VP of National Strategic Communications at Enterprise Canada. In the nation's capital, Jordan Leichnitz, former senior advisor to past federal NDP leaders, now a Canada program manager for the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. And in Waterloo, Ontario, Abhijit Manet, deputy leader of the Green Party of Ontario. And it's good to welcome you four onto our airwaves this evening as we do a little dissecting and analysis of what Ontarians in particular, but Canadians in general, had to say last night. And to that end, we're just going to start with a few graphics here to help tell the story. The province of Ontario. Now, this map doesn't necessarily indicate what happened because you look at this and you see, wow, lots of blue. I guess the Conservatives had a great night. Well, not exactly. What this map doesn't reflect too well is the fact that in the 50-plus ridings north of Lake Ontario, in the 416 and 905, that is overwhelmingly red. Ontario went red big time last night. Whoever wins Ontario wins the election, and the Liberals won Ontario. They won the election. Let's take a look at the state of play in the seat count and how things may have changed. If we go back to before the 2021 election, at dissolution, the Liberals had 155 seats. The Conservatives won 19, the Bloc 32, the NDP 24, 2 Greens, 5 independents and 1 vacant as well. And let's flip that over and see how things changed. Wow, not that much. The Liberals at 158, up 3. Conservatives 119. Bloc 34. NDP 25, that's up 1. Greens at 2, that's the same. People's Party got some votes, but no seats last night. John, why was this not a giant waste of time?
Well, because of the last word in your question, Steve, which is time. The election result, which is a healthy Liberal minority, continues the Trudeau government's time in office. And that's really important. The party was going to have to face the electorate sooner or later and seek to extend its mandate. And I think the result is positive. In evaluating whether it was a waste of time from the Liberal perspective, you'd want to ask yourself, compared to what scenario? The Liberals were very nervous about waiting a lot longer because they had rolled out pretty much everything they had to roll out in the spring 2021 budget. So if they had chosen to wait longer, sure, the pandemic would have eased off, some of the irritation level would have come down. But what would the Liberals have had to offer? More new spending? Not more money to throw around. Some dramatic new policy démarche? Hard to do without more new spending. So a lot of Liberals with long memories are haunted by what happened in the late 70s when Prime Minister Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, hesitated to call an election that everyone in 1978 said, you should wait till 79. And by 1979, everyone said, oh God, you should have done it back in 78. If you don't have a strong forward offer, you're really backing yourself into a heck of a strategic corner. That's the dilemma that the Prime Minister faced in choosing to call this election. So I think he refreshed his mandate at the right time. And I think people who are talking about how disappointed the Liberals are supposed to be are not seeing the defensive aspects of why this election was called when it was, and concentrating too much on the thirst for a majority, the offensive aspects, which of course have to be factored in. So I think Trudeau got a pretty decent result out of a tricky situation, and he should be pretty happy this morning.
David, the conventional wisdom is this was a status quo election, a big nothing burger. Why would you try to convince people that something wildly exciting happened last night?
Steve, I'd like to be able to say that there was some massive upset to the status quo that makes this more talking fodder. The fact of the matter is, the Liberals banked on that there was a change in public opinion. They banked on the notion that that the pandemic leadership would get them the extra seats necessary to give them a 4-year blank check, and that the pandemic had fundamentally reset a lot of the baggage that Mr. Trudeau had accumulated in the past 6 years. That bet didn't pay off. And to John's point, I think Liberals are relieved today. I mean, 3 weeks ago, they were staring at, quite frankly, an electoral defeat. Would have been one of the most catastrophic electoral calls in Canadian history. They escaped that. But they banked on this being a change, and that Trudeau could reap all kinds of plaudits for what he did last summer. And that obviously did not happen. And in fact, if anything changed, it crystallized in a lot of Canadians the reasons why that they don't have the fondness for Mr. Trudeau the way they did 6 years ago, and some of the more negative aspects of his personality and his style of leadership.
Jordan, would you attempt to convince Canadians that this was not a giant waste of time?
Well, I don't think an election is ever a waste of time, but I don't think it was a good night for Mr. Trudeau at all. The only way that this could be considered a real win for him is if we consider it in comparison to the potential scenarios that were emerging in the middle of the campaign. But at the end of the day, he went to the electorate because he wanted to seek a majority mandate. He didn't get that. And in fact, we're now back pretty much where we were before, except he's got a more challenging path ahead of him in this minority parliament. So I think that there should be a lot of soul searching on the part of Liberals about whether this was worth it. And I suspect more than a few of them wish they had a bit of a time machine to pull the plug a little earlier than they did.
Abhijit, where are you on this?
Well, I mean, I saw yesterday on Twitter somebody called it the most expensive cabinet shuffle in Canadian history. And it's, that's exactly what it was, is a massive waste of time, fueled mostly by hubris and ambition. And I mean, the money involved, $600 million that could have been spent, lifting how many boil water advisories, fueling and funding how many climate action projects. Not to mention, this was during a pandemic. So how many candidates, volunteers, as well as voters were exposed to COVID-19 when they didn't have to? So I think it was an incredibly ill-timed election, and I'm glad that the Canadian electorate sort of chastened the Prime Minister and gave him the same result, saying, go work with the other parties, because that's what minority governments make others do.
Okay, that's an open question. Let me put that to John Duffy. I guess the morning after analysis would like to suggest that the Prime Minister should feel, Abhijit's use of the word chastened is not a bad word, humbled. He should now be able to read the writing on the wall that, no, you actually weren't that close to a majority government. In fact, we're not only going to keep you on a leash, you're lucky we sort of brought you back at all. Do you think he gets that?
I think Jordan's really said something characteristically astute. I think the Liberals wish they could have gone in the spring. And if the fourth wave hadn't started to materialize, if the third wave had ended differently, they would have had a window and they would have done it. I think when you take that as your starting point, and I buy that starting point, the sense of having hubristically hazarded it all for the big win gets tempered a little bit by understanding that Liberals were probably, in their own estimation, on a melting ice cube, and they had to make their move. So are they chastened? Look, when you don't get a big bump, you realize maybe everybody doesn't love you as much as you wish you were loved. You might feel a little underappreciated. But the key thing that has actually happened here, and for those who want to keep relitigating why the election call of 2021 happened, go ahead and do so, because public policy is actually moving on here. We're going to get, as a result of this election victory, the federal provincial deals for a national child care program will now lock in. We are going to get the affordability in housing that is pretty much universally supported throughout Parliament. We're going to get continued vigorous pandemic management dissented from by the Conservative Party. We're going to get continuation on a slow moving but quite massive in dollar terms reconciliation agenda. So
John, let me just jump in. I get all that, John, but you were going to get any of that. You were going to get all and any of that anyway.
I don't agree with that at all, Steve. With 2 years to go, in a deteriorating political situation with nothing new to offer and no more spending bullets to fire, what were the Liberals going to have in the way of political leverage to command a minority parliament? The fear of an election on the part of the opposition party would have shrunk, and the government's ability to work its will in parliament would have shrunk accordingly. It's fallacious to suggest that the government would have continued exactly as it was had they not had this election at this time. Politics is always moving, and I believe the Liberal situation was deteriorating on the way into this election, slowly, not very perceptibly, but it actually was, regardless of what the polling said. Their political position was eroding.
David, do you see this prime minister as having been humbled by the result last night?
Oh, for sure. And you know, Steve, John said something telling a couple seconds ago when he talked about some of the calculations that the prime minister's brain trusts were putting in play during the spring. You know, they wanted to kind of fit in the election call after the third wave, which again, it's a plague that's killing people. But before the fourth wave, which again is a plague that's killing people. And their fixation was, well, how can we thread that needle? How can we operate thread the needle between a generational pandemic in order to get more power for ourselves? And I think that just confirms a lot of what people don't like about politics and a lot of what people don't like about this prime minister. And we can slice the results any number of ways, Steve. But the fact that you know, he's lost the popular vote twice. He lost to Andrew Scheer. He lost to Darren O'Toole. You know, the number of people. This is the lowest share of the popular vote I think any Canadian prime minister's ever had. And I think that absolutely should be humbling to anybody in the orbit of the prime minister. Yes, he won the election, but there's so much troubling about how this happened.
As you, Jordan, looked at the last parliament, and I would like to just focus for a second on what John advanced, which is the notion that the Liberals' position in the last parliament was beginning to deteriorate, and therefore the need to renew that mandate, now get a fresh mandate so that the prime minister can bring in his program. As I looked at the last parliament, it seemed to me that the prime minister was getting everything passed that he wanted to get passed, including, I think, 8 jurisdictions in this country signing childcare agreements with the federal government of the day. As you looked at it, did you sense that the New Democrats were about to pull the plug on this guy and send everybody to the polls because he couldn't get his program through Parliament, and therefore this election was necessary?
Yeah, Steve, I think you're exactly right there. And, you know, I believe John when he says that the Liberals felt that they were on a melting iceberg here. I think in some ways this is the election that inertia brought us. Once you start down that path, it can be really difficult to pull out. And I think that there should probably be some soul searching in Liberal HQ about when they got locked in on this. Because the reality is that there's a difference between Parliament being challenging for a minority government and it being non-functional. And I think that we were squarely in the first column. Jagmeet Singh was very clear that he was not going to pull support from the Liberals to cause an election. He was very clear that he was supportive of the childcare program, of the climate program, obviously, and even bringing improvements into things like the wage subsidy and CERB. So, you know, there was a lot that was working about that parliament. And I think that the harsh reality is that when we look at what went on this election, really, it was the election call that put in jeopardy things like the childcare agreements. And that falls entirely on the prime minister and his team.
Abhijit, I want to put the notion to you, and then I'll hear John follow up on it, of the status of Mr. Trudeau's leadership today. I got to tell you, I got so many text messages from people last night saying, well, this is clearly it for Trudeau. He's not even going to make it through this parliament. That was his last election. And I just keep thinking to myself, whoa, I mean, he did win. Let's not shoo him to the exit so quickly. Can I get your take on whether or not you think this election was so chastening for him that he's in trouble?
I think Mr. Trudeau has incredibly been politically resilient throughout his political career, so I wouldn't count him out so soon. But I think definitely yesterday I saw a lot of commentators, and especially, you know, talking to some Liberal Party friends of mine as well, had told me that the Prime Minister should be watching for the knives coming out. But I think he still has the resilience to pull through this term. If not, there are people waiting in the Liberal Party, I think, who can take over from him.
Well, John, unless I'm not seeing something that's really obvious out there, I don't see a dynamic of a Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin situation here where there's some obvious heir apparent waiting in the wings with the knives out, ready to pounce. I don't see it. How would you characterize the state of Mr. Trudeau's leadership today?
I agree with you. It's absolutely rock secure. And there's two reasons for that. Number one, there isn't a Dauphin. There isn't an heir apparent that's all lined up. And number two, the Liberal Party's restructured itself under Justin Trudeau specifically to avoid the creation of succession disputes with sitting prime ministers. The era of sort of, knife wielding private armies inside the House of the Liberal Party, that sort of Game of Thrones stuff has really been stepped away on, and the party has restructured itself. So there isn't anyone who's going to take a run at the prime minister. There isn't a current of opinion in the party, I think, that wants to do that, which is really important. And I don't actually think the situation occasions it. I think there will be pressure from pundits and people who seek to advance the narrative and the storyline to say, well, surely, you have hubristically fallen, O great king, and now you must fall upon your sword. Surely you will. But I just don't think that's the way this is going to play out. He's got a lot of time. Don't forget, no one's going to be in a hurry to go back to the polls. The opposition are not going to be in a hurry to trigger the election. The Liberals aren't going to be throwing their weight around in Parliament saying we have to go to the polls right now, not after what nearly happened to them. So I think, look, most Canadian minority governments are succeeded by a minority government. That's usually the dynamic in this country, sometimes by two in a row. And we've had minority governments last for as long as 4 years in this country. There's no reason why that doesn't happen. And I don't predict finis for Justin Trudeau. Don't forget one other thing. He's won every election he's ever run in. A really good point that his good friend of mine, Jerry Butts, made on television last night. This guy is not a bruised, fighter near the end of his powers. He's a career winner. He's not doing too badly in my estimation.
Let's now pivot and take a look at the opposition parties. And David, we'll start with you. On the one hand, second consecutive election, Conservatives win the most number of votes in the country. On the other hand, too many wasted votes in the West, not a very efficient vote in the rest of the country, and a party that may be at odds with its leader ideologically. How do you as a Conservative see where your party is this morning?
Erin O'Toole is certainly entitled to try to go back to the Conservative Party members and highlight, I think, some very strong elements of his platform and the discipline of the campaign he ran. But for those who aren't active and have not been active in conservative politics, and I see some commentary saying, oh, Mr. O'Toole should get a second shot, and he deserves the opportunity to make that case. The challenge within the Conservative Party is when members of the party evaluate potential leaders, they ask two questions. They ask, do I believe you can win? And am I confident you won't betray me on the issues and policies that matter most to me? And the most successful leaders, for instance, Dr. Haiti and Mr. Harper, the answer to those two questions was yes. He was able to give people confidence that he was not going to let them down on issues of importance, and he was a winner. The challenge for Mr. O'Toole right now is that clearly the results show that he was not successful, and he made a bet, a deliberate strategic calculation that for a lot of members of the party will feel like a betrayal, and that bet didn't pay off. And that's going to be a difficult sales pitch for him, not an impossible one, a difficult sales pitch for him. A lot of conservatives are conservatives because they have social conservative values. A lot of conservatives are conservatives because they find the notion of forcing families to pay a carbon tax to heat their homes or drive their kids to school an unfair way to fight climate change. They put a lot of water in their wine at Mr. O'Toole's request, and that bet didn't pay off. And I think he really needs to think about how he's going to make the case to the members of the party about why this template would succeed next time.
The bet didn't pay off this time, but I well remember Dalton McGuinty telling a story about after he lost his first election, he got a call from someone who said, you know what, you learned a lot by losing. See how things go next time. And of course, next time he became Premier of Ontario. Are there enough Conservatives in your judgment who will conclude today, no, he didn't win his first time out, but he learned a lot and he's entitled to a second shot?
It'll be a debate. It'll be a debate. I think, like I say, Mr. O'Toole can point to a number of very strong things he did in his platform, in his campaign and his discipline, and said, like I have a template to actually get us over the top here. At the same time, the issues, even not even about left or right or moderate or ideological. It's about relevance. And did his approach prove to be relevant enough Canadians or Ontarians to get over the top? Well, no, it didn't. The campaign did not work, and he asked a lot of Conservative voters to put a lot of water in their wine on this in terms of issues that are near and dear to the heart, saying this is the path to victory. And when that bet doesn't pay off, at the very least, he needs to answer some serious questions, which he should have the opportunity to answer. And if he can answer them well, he'll get a second shot. But again, I think a lot of the consensus on what was holding back the Conservative Party in Ontario under Mr. Scheer was they weren't moderate enough on climate issues or social issues. And they chose a leader who did everything the pundits wanted him to do, everything the consultant class wanted him to do. They chose the path. And if anything, they're as far back today as they were then. And I think that's a issue that will be litigated in the Conservative Party, and that's healthy. And that it's healthy for parties after a election disappointment to actually ask the question, what went wrong? Was this bad luck, or was it bad strategic decisions? And I know, and Mr. O'Toole should be able to answer those questions. And if he does it well, he should get a second chance. But he hasn't answered those questions yet.
One more fast follow-up. I believe your party's constitution requires a leadership review within 2 years after a failed election outcome. He didn't win. Well, I guess that constitutes a failed outcome.
Yep.
If you go to that convention, would you vote to remove him as leader or let him stay on?
Listen, I've met Aaron O'Toole. I know a number of members of his team. I would go in that convention with some very pointed questions. About the kind of compromises that he asked members to make. But I go in as well with an open mind to hear his answers. And if he answers them well, I would be open to giving him a second chance. But quite frankly, like I spent a lot of my career in politics, Steve, arguing against the notion of a carbon tax as the optimal way to fight climate change, because the carbon tax is wealthy, well-connected people forcing new burdens on the poor and powerless. And there are better ways to fight climate change than through a carbon tax. That's as the leader, he won the leadership, and he chose a path that some people in the party would have been uncomfortable with, which is fine. But that didn't work out, and I think now members of the party deserve to say, okay, we like you say, we joined you and we supported you in making this compromise. It didn't work out. We're not going to give you a blank check for more of the same.
Okay, getcha. Jordan, let's put the spotlight on the NDP leader right now. The polls always show he's the most popular leader out there. The polls show the kids love him. He's a superstar on TikTok. And once again, for a second consecutive election, all of that added up to not a whole heck of a lot. Got pretty much the same percentage of the total vote, got pretty much the same seat count. Where's the NDP at today?
I don't think Jagmeet had a bad night last night. He was able to solidify a lot of his positive fundamentals. This campaign, more Canadians got to know him. This is only his second cycle, so that's not insignificant. And I think that culturally within the New Democratic Party, with obviously one exception, we tend to have a little bit more patience for leaders taking some time to establish themselves. And we saw that obviously pay off in spades with Jack. So I'm certainly not hearing any concerns internally about Jagmeet's leadership. And in fact, I'm seeing a lot of people who are excited about some of the bases that we've built across the country here. So for him, I think overall, not a bad night. Obviously, more seats is always better. But we've also still got 1 million votes out there to count. And I think that we may see some of those close races flip still.
You know, Jordan, New Democrats, if they ever did anything, they used to love to drown us in policy. And I mean, you guys love these policy debates at your conventions. And the one observation I've heard from so many people is that this was one of the most vapidly run election campaigns that the NDP have ever run, because Mr. Singh, basically all he said was, we're going to fight for you, we're going to fight for you, we're going to fight for you, and everything is Justin Trudeau's fault. And it didn't go much beyond that. Is he still a good fit for your party?
Absolutely. I think that Jagmeet ran a really disciplined contrast campaign, and that's something that maybe people aren't entirely accustomed to from New Democrats, but he showed his grasp of the policy issues during the debates. And for those who really do love to deep dive on the policy, you know, there was a 100-page platform for that. But there is a reward out there, I think, for New Democrats when we do run campaigns that run a tight contrast with the Liberals, because ultimately that is what the case that we need to make to voters, that there is a cost to continuing with the Justin Trudeau government, that there is a reason that they need to send more New Democrats to Ottawa. And I think that right now, Jagmeet is going to have a strengthened hand in this next minority parliament. He's got a proven record of getting some results for Canadians that he has the opportunity to build on. So I don't think he's actually badly positioned at all.
Abhijit, to the extent that there was anything kind of shocking about last night's results, it was the fact that the leader of the Green Party, Enemy Paul, didn't win Toronto Centre. I'm not sure a lot of people thought she'd win Toronto Centre, but she came fourth in Toronto Centre after just a year ago placing a pretty competitive second place in the by-election there. What happened?
I mean, it's just unfortunate that Enemy didn't do better. I mean, we've always said that she would be a very important voice in the House of Commons, but it's been a challenging few months, right? We've seen everything play out in the media with the internal issues that existed within the Green Party of Canada, and also while she was a new leader. We've seen this happen in other parties as well. When new leaders come in, there's a lot of internal turmoil, but it's just tough. And regardless, she ran a very strong campaign. I campaigned with her in Toronto Centre, and also obviously she had an amazing performance, a very strong performance at the English language debates, which many pundits said she won outright. So it's just something that I think she'll have to do some introspection on. But I really think she gave it her all.
Well, I got to follow up on that. I mean, how much introspection is there to do? She does not have a seat in the House of Commons. She's got a party that basically wants her out. I watched her concession speech last night, and she did not give any indication whether she intended to fight to maintain her leadership or was going to step down in the relatively near future. Do you have any insight on that?
Well, I think ultimately it ends up being her decision, her family's call, if she wants to step down or not, and obviously up to GPC membership. There will be a leadership review shortly, but we need her bold and daring voice in politics, and whatever she decides to do, I will support her call.
Do you think she can stay on as leader?
I think she has a chance, for sure. I think, we can't rule her out completely. She's always been a very tough and daring politician who sort of bucks the trend. But like I said, I would support any decision that she makes.
All right, let's read. You guys all know Jen Gerson. She has a way of, what do we say? She has a way of putting things. Yeah. And we have a little excerpt from something she wrote in The Line just a few days ago. In calling this election at this moment, Trudeau stumbled into a moment of unique historic significance. And what the F have we spent the last 6 weeks faffing on about? Two-tier healthcare, a phrase I had not heard in a decade prior to this election. Something abortions, something guns. When to raise flags all the way back up the mast. We're moving forward or securing our future. What we're moving forward to and what we're securing our future from is unclear to me. This isn't an election, Jen writes. It's a dozen brilliant little talking point gems, sparkling with the patina of a dozen focus groups and intended to chip away a few hundred accessible votes in key swing ridings. What a damnable waste of everybody's time. This was an election about nothing. It's a tribute to vanity and an excuse for the callow pursuit of a power with no aim. As we often like to tell Jen, get off the fence and tell us what you really think. Okay, John, come. I know you don't agree with that. So maybe as we look to what potentially good came out of last night, what would you point to in saying, and again, not from a liberal point of view. I understand the liberals are happy that they've renewed their mandate, but from the average Ontarian, the average Canadian, what was the value in last night?
We've set a course that won't be changed now. And it'll fill out a period of upwards of 10 years of Trudeau government by the end of this, the best part of 10 years, in which the country is going to have taken a material step on income inequality, historically instituted a national price on carbon, a remarkable achievement, will have clearly managed its way through the pandemic, and will have taken further steps on a national child care program. These achievements might not address completely the massive upheavals going on around the world and on our own land and on our own soil. And we might be as far along, for example, on Indigenous reconciliation as everyone would like us to be. But the course has been set, and it's not the course of the Harper government, whose core agenda was to make Canada an oil and gas superpower and to cut some taxes and to be a stalwart Western alliance partner. It's a different course. It will now be carried through for the best part of 10 years. That is set by last night's result. That is actually, when future historians look back on this, going to be what was on the line here. And it could have gone a very different way. So I don't buy the Seinfeld election story. And I don't think when the distaste for the election call has dissipated like a bad odor, and it'll take some time, I don't think people will regard this as an empty election, just a continuity election. And that's a very different proposition.
No, fair point. And David, I'll get you to comment on this because I'm sure we all remember there was a cabinet minister a decade and a half ago named Ken Dryden, who was the minister in charge of signing childcare agreements with various provinces and got that done. And then the Liberals had the plug pulled on them. They had an election. Stephen Harper came in, and that was the end of all of that. Mr. Dryden actually sent me an email today in which he said essentially what John did, which is you can't say everybody lost. Childcare won, and now it will be around forever and ever.
And I got to say this, Steve. Martin's agenda was Kelowna, kids, and Kyoto. That, in many respects, is the Trudeau agenda. There is a continuity here with the broad course of Liberal policy, and it's not a bad night for those of us who have fought for it.
In which case, David, can I get you to comment on that in as much as this agenda from a decade and a half ago, I mean, it looks like John's right. It's in and it's staying.
But in fairness, Steve, the election of Stephen Harper didn't kill childcare reform in Canada or Ontario. The template, the lesson that I think that conservatives or other Canadians or other parties of any persuasion should take from what happened 15 years ago, it was an exercise of relevance. There was an issue with the affordability of childcare. The Liberal Party of the day rolled out a state institutionalized daycare model. Harper countered with a relevant counter idea: let's just give the money to parents. And one of the most signature successes of the Trudeau government, though he will never admit it, was saying, yes, Stephen Harper was right. The Canadian child benefit is, in fact, a Stephen Harper conservative innovation that the Liberals built on. And so the lesson is, when someone says, "Oh, the only way is to do something through public sector unions or institutions or state or massive programs," and conservatives, well, no, there are other ways to achieve important social ends, whether it's childcare or climate or affordability or anything else, and make that a relevant exercise. The one other thing I'd say about the Gerson column, Steve, I think that's important, is one of the biggest victims of this campaign was the Justin Trudeau of 2015, who, as far as I can tell, was murdered by the Justin Trudeau of 2021. I've long been a critic of this government, this prime minister, but there was a moment of time in that first election. Better is always possible, sunny ways. He did actually embody for a lot of Canadians that we could break out of the cheap negative, divisive politics. That Trudeau is gone, is dead and buried. And whoever was giving that victory speech last night was not the Justin Trudeau of 2015. And the blame for that rests on Justin Trudeau himself.
John, I suspect you want to take issue with that. I'm not sure you can say he's dead and buried. He may not have been around this election, but the next few years may resurrect him. Who knows?
We all get older. We all age. Time passes. Baggage accumulates. Time is all we've got in this life and in politics. Justin Trudeau bought himself some more time with this election call. And Ken Dryden's right. Some of these foundations have been laid for towers that are built to last and will be a part of Canadian society for a very long, long time to come. I think that's the takeaway on this. Yeah, is this figure the young King Arthur who came dashing into Camelot of 2015? No. He is older, grayer, more wintry. The land grows old and weary, and someday the blood will be watered with his kingship demise. Okay, that's politics. It changes. That's life. It changes. But today, winter got put off just a few more years for this liberal agenda that so many Canadians support and that so many liberals have fought for so long. It's not a bad night, not a bad day.
Hang on. I got Anthony Cimolino on line 2 here. He wants you down at the Stratford Festival right now for a part he wants you to play. Okay, we don't normally spend a lot of time talking about parties that don't win any seats, but the People's Party may have had an impact on the outcome of this election despite having won no seats. And Jordan, maybe I'll get you to speak to that first. You could look all over this country and find that the difference between a Conservative losing an election and a Liberal, for example, winning an election, the difference was the same number as the number of People's Party votes in that riding. Now, you can't automatically say every time that if you just added up the People's Party and the Conservative votes, that gets you a victory. You can't do it, but you can do some of it. And I wonder how influential you think they were in the outcome of the next Parliament.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Steve. And I don't know the answer to how influential they were in terms of the overall makeup of the Parliament, because that's going to require some more deep diving at a seat-by-seat level. But I do think what's becoming clear is that they did pull the majority of their vote from the Conservatives. We've obviously seen them triple their popular vote. So this is worrying. This is a fringe party that represents some pretty reprehensible ideas. I think that there is some soul searching to be done on the part of Canadians here about how they have grown so much and why their message resonated potentially with some people who might have become disengaged with the political process. And, our house was leafleted by them, like I think many were. And the message that they had was really for working class people who felt like they were being left out of the system, that they were no longer being treated as essential. So I think a lot of the stuff that gets the front page attention is the really kooky anti-vaccine stuff, which is bad and dangerous. But underneath that, there is a class narrative there that I think we have to really look carefully at and make sure that all parties are being aware of.
David, I'm down to my last minute. Do you think the People's Party showing cost Aaron O'Toole an opportunity to become Prime Minister last night?
I think Jordan made an important point there, Steve, where there's two theories where the People's Party support comes from. Is it a moment in time where they're pulling a lot of anti-vaxxers who we all know they have a deleterious impact on public health and they're not helpful or constructive in any way, shape, or form, but they exist and the People's Party were the only vehicle for them? Or B, were they disaffected voters from other parties? And Jordan said, the degree to which they came from the Conservative Party is significant, and that's a continuum. I'd say I like what political nerds do, Steve. I took some time looking at some of the writing results this morning. I found about 5 ridings in Canada where for sure the PPC contributed, like Niagara Centre and Kitchener-Conestoga were 2 I saw in Ontario for sure. But most of the ridings that the Conservatives won or lost, the PPC wasn't a factor in that. And so I think the hope is as this anti-vax furor dies down, does the PPC actually have staying power, or is this a moment in time fueled by a very angry set of people on a very singular issue? And I think that remains to be seen as we see how things progress.
To be continued. I want to thank you for coming on to TVO tonight and sharing your analysis of the day after the night before. John Duffy, David Tarrant, Jordan Leichnitz, Abhijit Manet. Good to see you all.
Thanks.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.